Today's session, today's Sky Academy session will be regarding the use of custom lists. Now, some of you probably have had some experience with this just in your normal day-to-day usage, and that's great. We're going to talk about, um, just reminders of other options, things that sometimes when I talk to people, they tell me that they've never considered. So it's something that can be a tool for you for the future and something that can just be there available for you. So that's our goal for this morning. All right. So just pre-warning, I am in local databases, which means the data sometimes looks funny. Not funny, haha, funny, weird. So if you see something that seems slightly off, probably because of that. All right. So we are going to start out under the main menu, administrative access. And just because it's one of the areas that most people work with on a regular basis, I'm going to be starting under student list. Many of the principles that I'm going to talk about today can be applied not only to the student list that I'll concentrate on this morning, but also can be extended to things like the staff list, or if you work in state reporting, or if you do things with attendance that you need to go ahead and maintain certain types of lists for as well, can be useful. So student list. All right. Now, I did a small cleanup. The default view, and just as a reminder, when you are looking at the screen for student list views, or actually any list, you've got the little eyeball over here. That is your view. The view is essentially going to be the columns that your user has access to view. Now, some of what we might talk about today might be things that maybe you personally don't have access to. That doesn't mean it's not a good tool, though. And it doesn't mean that you couldn't potentially reach out to somebody at your district that does have the security for it, maybe, and explain to them what you were looking at. So I'm going to click on the little eyeball for a moment just so you can see. I'm going to flip back to Skyward Views, Skyward Default for a moment. So we have a default view. It has, general information, but that's sometimes not exactly all we're looking for. Now, one of the things I did do is I attached to this Academy session a couple, or it's one document, and that document is going to be have a couple fields or have a set of fields in each of 3 topics. I did one for scheduling view, just because I find that as the year's winding down, as you're prepping to get ready for the next school year to start, a lot of your troubleshooting, at least for individuals that work with schedules, is focused on scheduling and making sure requests are in, or making sure you've got the right number of classes scheduled. So there's a scheduling view that we're going to talk about this morning. There is also 2 extra lists in there. They're examples of what you might look at doing if you wanted something like a special programs view. And the idea basically being that sometimes it's useful to be able to see them. And for something like a special programs view, the reason something like that can be nice is because when I'm on a student list like this, I do have certain things that come up. Like I've got my health indicator, student locator, MTSS, like I said, local database. So I've got that. What's my quick filter right now? I don't have any filters. Interesting. Hold on. Sorry, it seemed like too few kids. No, that's 49 kids. So that's everybody. But basically, we've got a finite number of records that we're going to be looking at. So when we're looking at maintaining a record, I can go through and I can, of course, delete certain things. So if you're a campus or district that or entity that doesn't really have students that switch or flip-flop between entities, you might opt to say, you know what, I really don't need the column for default entity. Versus if you are a district that has, let's say, 4 or 6 or however many elementary schools, and because of zoning, maybe you have kids that end up flipping back and forth between a couple schools. So there might be cause for you to delete columns. Just as a reminder, anything that you do to these screens is only really affecting your list. By the same token, if I'm working with a middle school or elementary school, I don't really need the graduation date so much. That's actually another list that I've done with districts before. Actually making a screen that was specifically for graduation information, like the graduation date, are they marked as graduated? And then when we look at more state-specific things, what that state's graduation plan is for them, and those kinds of elements. I can go ahead and say, you know what, for now, I don't really need my birth date. Don't need my racial or ethnicity information, but I can clean up my screen a little bit. The reason I mention this is sometimes when we start adding in columns, you'll find that you add in these extra columns, and it goes ahead and doesn't follow, or you add in the extra columns and then your screen's really busy. What we're looking at right now is I'm on an entity right now. Because of the way these views work, there are two types of primary views. There is the entity view, which would carry through for the settings, whether I'm looking at this entity 001 or if I were looking at 101. I would flip and all of the columns would stay the same. On the other hand, if I went up to the district, because there are certain fields that are not available at the district level, I would go ahead and not necessarily have the same view there. And so there is, it's got its own setting where you can set up something at a district level. And I know not everyone will have district level access, but that is where it would potentially come in. Also, when we're working with student lists, as a reminder, if you click and hold with the left button, you can drag and drop. For sorting purposes, the first column that you highlight is your default search. If I hit Shift and then click another column, that will be the secondary filter, or not filter, sort option. And then I can go down from there. And so if, for example, I had a lot of people who had very similar first, middle, last names, maybe I'm going to go ahead and throw in grade level as an additional sort option, just to go ahead and break it up. Now, don't get me wrong, the system will put people in order, but if you want some extra control over it, being able to set those in place. And you'll notice, I'm going to zoom in a little bit. You see how it's got my up arrow and then the number, up arrow and the number. That is my sort information. So this is going from A to Z, and this is going from low to high. So just things to consider as we do those. So if we're talking about adding in extra columns, if you are a general user, your column access is going to be controlled completely by your security. If you are someone at the district who actually has system-wide access, you're going to have access to more columns than a general user would. Now, there's advantages to having somebody who has system-wide access create a list. If a list gets created by someone who is at a district level, and we'll get to the point where I show you guys how to make district views, you'll actually be able to utilize that in such a way that you can share that out to the other users without them maybe needing to make this for themselves. And so sometimes that is an agreeable way to go ahead and handle this kind of information for us. So I'm going to come in here after student number and look at the gear, and I'm going to insert column. Now, things for you to know, if you haven't, some of you guys have maybe had some experience with adding in columns, and maybe you haven't even had the best of luck with that. Maybe just because you feel like you're looking for things and you're not finding what you're looking for specifically. So things to consider. When you first hit that gear and you hit the insert, it's going to open you up to a specific folder. So in this case, it is saying that is opening me to the student entity here. There are certain fields, even though I myself am a system-wide user, there are certain fields that are only for system-wide. So for example, you see this little shield right here with the person. That is indicating that this field by itself is intended for system-wide users. Now, there was a security update to Skyward that does allow those fields to get unlocked. The database that I'm in right now doesn't have that functionality showing, so I can't show that right now, but there is a function that would show up here for someone who was a current system-wide user to be able to allow someone else or other users to be able to use that field. But these fields, sometimes they're things that are very specific and useful. Sometimes they're things every once in a while I wonder, wait, why is that one secured and why is this one not? There's a reason behind it. I don't always know what all of them are, but there are reasons behind them. So the way this is broken out, I've got my general fields. If I keep scrolling down a little bit further, I've got my folders. These are areas that are related to what I'm looking at, but are not necessarily in the same data area as what I'm looking at. So for example, I am on a student list, but I am looking at the student entity year information, which means if I want student information, I have to scroll down and now I've got a folder for student. And so there are certain things like that that will come up. So if you ever find something like that, keep that in mind. So let's look at some of these field options. So if we talk about scheduling, for example, I've got number of student course requests. So maybe I'm getting gearing up for the end of the year and I'm trying to figure out, ooh, does everybody have all the requests they need for the year? So I could add in a column for number of student course requests. Now, I am in 22-23. If I'm actually planning for next year, then I need to make sure that the school year I'm working with is the correct school year, because that column is actually feeding off of the combination of the entity I am currently on and the school year. So do bear that in mind if you happen to be looking at some of the data. What school year are you looking at in addition to what entity? Now, something I like to do when I am adding in columns, this is not required, but it's something that I like. One, because it cleans up the area and keeps it from looking a little bit busy, but two, because I just like things to be named the way I want them to be. So if I hit that gear again, I can actually rename this and just say that this is number of requests, because let's face it, they're student requests. I don't really need the word student on it. And I know that they're course requests because that's what I asked for. And in this context, because I'm working with scheduling, I don't need it to say number of student requests. So I can rename it. Now you'll notice this has a width of 120. I can actually change this all the way down to 65. And that can go ahead and help keep things just a little bit more compressed. I could do the same thing. Well, no, grade level's already at 65, but I could do something similar for student number, saying that, you know what, let me bump this down to 85, make that column a little bit smaller. So I've got things like that that I can do. I normally will add number of requests as a field. There is also number of there's number of student sections. So this is sort of the counterpart to the number of requests. We make the requests before we do the student scheduling for the year. After the student's been scheduled, either manually or using one of the utilities, either the individual student scheduler or the mass student scheduler, eventually I will end up with a total number of classes scheduled for this student, or in this context, number of student sections. This can be a good lookup even for somebody who is not working with high school per se. If I go ahead and have number of classes in here, I can actually use that to go ahead and see, do these kids have the right number of classes assigned to them? And, you know, we always hope that the answer is yes, absolutely. This kid has exactly what they should. But sometimes, you know, there's questions. Keep in mind, if you are working with segmented classes, elementary, middle school sometimes have it easy because sometimes they're only going to be working with year long. Everything's year long. So aside from that, it's fine. High school and occasionally middle school will have oftentimes semester-based classes. And if I do have semester-based classes, something like that can make it so that my number of requests gets skewed and the number of scheduled classes ends up looking skewed. Not that it's wrong, but it might throw off the count that in my head I'm looking for. So just keep that in mind. I can also come down here and add a column for has conflicted course requests. So one of the things that the system does is when, for middle school and high school typically, when the auto scheduler for the student courses gets run, either on an individual student basis or in mass, if the requests cannot be scheduled, it flags that student as having a conflict. Now, the thing I like about the conflict column is once they're corrected, that column, it unchecks. So basically it's a way to go ahead and look for and help resolve for yourself things that are still outstanding to work on for the upcoming year. So I'm renaming it Conflicts Exist. That makes sense to me. Once again, your naming convention does not have to match mine at all. It's just that's how I like to name it. So Conflicts Exist. And you'll notice this one actually does have one that is Conflicts Exist. Conflicts Exist can be anything simple like I schedule or I requested for this kid horticulture, and horticulture never made, but I never removed it from the kids who asked for horticulture. So that's always going to be a conflict for those kids because I literally put a class on them that there's no way for them to get. And so there's going to be times that that could exist. But because it's in here and because it's a column, I can utilize this and I can actually filter by it. Now on the, I'm actually surprised, only one. So I could come in here and use it. So basically if I fix these conflicts, then, or this the conflict on this kid, then I would get none. And so ideally, anytime you're making something like this, that would work. Now I have one in here that, let me show you what this one would look like. Here's one that I've made previously that go ahead and are for scheduling. Has conflicts, the one I just added, the number of requests, the number of classes. I can also add columns in for number of unscheduled requests. And if you ever rename something and you're wondering, somebody asked you, oh, you've got that column there. What's that column? And because the column, if you rename it, it's not going to exactly match what somebody else might name it. If you hit that gear again and you go down towards the bottom, you're going to actually see what the name of that field actually is, as opposed to just having to try and guess what that field name actually is. There is unscheduled requests, unscheduled sections, overscheduled periods. Now, overscheduled is an important distinction to unscheduled requests because oftentimes those happen completely unintentionally, but they do happen. Most common reason for it is you're going through, you're cleaning up, and you move this one section of a course that happens to have kids assigned to it to another period. So now you've got a kid who maybe used to be in third period of this class and is now in seventh period, but they already had a seventh period class. So on the actual auto scheduler run, they didn't have a conflict because at that time, they might not have had a conflict from that. But if I go ahead and move something in, I can end up with an overscheduled period. And so that's something else to work on before then. I also typically will recommend that you add in columns for earned possible. Once again, works better for high school than necessarily middle school, and definitely doesn't really help with elementary. But earned possible is when you're at the request stage, are you requesting the correct number of credits? And then earned scheduled is after I've scheduled those classes, have I requested the correct number of classes in there? And I really don't want that column in there. It doesn't make any sense to be in there under a scheduling view. My guess is somebody was just making examples while they were doing it. All right, let me add in one more column just so we can see. There's other things in here that you can add as well. One that I sometimes end up adding in, especially if I am working with a district that has a lot of elementary campuses that use the value for homeroom that exists under the entity and not just a class that happens to be a homeroom class. I can actually come in and do homeroom under the fields and folders, and I can say, show me the staff for homeroom and pull me the name. And so I can actually have that in here, which if I'm working with, sometimes I even see it for secondary campuses, but I can actually come in here and I wouldn't leave it as just general full name. This one I would actually rename and make sure that I said that this was, you know, homeroom teacher. And go ahead and save that. And then that way I can have that there. And sometimes people are looking for a quick way to find that information. And that is one of those goals that when you are creating or using or working with any of these kinds of lists, these are things that you're wanting to add in that long term are going to be beneficial for you to have access to. Now, we've been talking about it in terms of useful for you. Let's go ahead and do the first thing I recommend after I've got a list that I really like. And there's a reason to do this, even if you don't know if you're going to use this list very often. If I come back up to the eyeball, the view, and under the scheduling view that I had been working with, there's a spot in here now that says enter new view name. Because I have made changes, the system is giving me the opportunity to name the view I am working with. If I have just spent or invested a lot of time in this view that I'm working with, I can save it. That means that even if I add in a whole bunch of extra columns later, delete a whole bunch or anything like that, I can always return to this view the way it was when I originally saved the view. And so that can be very nice from the perspective that I have that ability to get back into that information again. So I'm going to say, I'm just going to call it focused scheduling view just for now, but make it something that makes sense to you. I'm going to save it as a new view. And so now this is going to exist. Now I'm going to go ahead, and the shortcut that I'm going to give you works if you do it from a Windows machine. I'm sure there's probably a way to do it from a Mac or Apple product. I don't know what that one is, but if you do Control Alt F3 on a list screen, it will tell you the list you are on. It'll tell you what version. It'll tell you a whole bunch of information. And then it's going to have something that's not going to look super obvious, but it's going to say ID and then have a number, and then view ID. It's going to have a number. If I go ahead and click on here, now this is going to depend on your security, okay? So if it doesn't let you do it, just bear in mind that you didn't do anything wrong. You definitely didn't break it. It just is security related thing. But if I click on it, it's going to have taken me directly to a screen that is under customization and browse. It's trying to shortcut me to a spot where if I wanted to, I could actually create default district browses. And so in this case, because I am on an entity, and it's under entity year. I am student, student, student list, student entity year list, browse. I've got general and I've got views. If I go down to views, it's going to show me my options in here. Now, I've got the standard one. I've got the scheduling view that I first opened up when I was showing you the example. And then I've got this focused scheduling view that I've created. Now that focused scheduling view, I could come in and I could do the drop down. And you'll notice in here, it gives me an option to clone. And you might be wondering, why do I want to clone? Well, for one, the view that I'm looking at is currently a user view. If it is left as a user view, only I can see it. But if I clone it, and once it gets there, if I change my type to district, I can go ahead and make it a district view, which means not only myself, but anyone else in my district who has access to the screen that I am on would have access to this special view that we've made. And so that can be great. So now I can go ahead and I can save this. I did not check the box is default. Is default is one that you might want to do if you're wanting the default view to change, but not necessarily something that you're going to do if you want something else in general. So now I could actually go back to my student list. And this part's going to look slightly weird because I did the focused scheduling view and it's still under the eyeball. But if I click that again, I've got the one that I am currently looking at, and I know that this is the one I'm looking at because it's grayed out. And I've got the one up here under district views. If you are looking at your screens right now under the eyeball for the view options and you do not see the verbiage, district views, not anything that you've done wrong. It just means that no district views for the screen that you are on have previously been created. And as such, that area is not showing up. Once the first district view gets created, then you will actually see that sub area. So if I come down and I hit apply for the focus scheduling view, that will go ahead and pull that in. I've got all of that information. And I could basically tell another coworker, hey, you were mentioning that you're trying to troubleshoot future scheduling, do that last cleanup before the end of the school year. Go ahead and use this to do it. The columns that I was recommending, as I mentioned before, there should be a document attached to this session that has column recommendations for the future scheduling views. Another thing that I will often display, let me go back to this one. I did one of these cleaned up so I didn't have a whole bunch of extra columns. And so I did it as a limited view. Another thing that I will often create with people is, I mentioned special programs. I have also done one that I had a district that used mail merge all the time for lots of different reasons. And as such, they wanted access to the primary mailing address for the student on a regular basis and didn't want to have to keep running reports for it. So we actually built in to their student list screen the ability to go ahead and have, the primary guardian name and the information for that. So let's look for a moment though and look at special programs information. So the gear, upper right-hand corner, and I'm going to insert column. I am currently on a Texas database. I'll flip and look at an Indiana one for a few moments, but I'll do that in just a bit. But one thing I want to mention, so same as what we were seeing when we were doing scheduling, I'm starting out under the folder for student entity year. When we start talking about things like special programs, special ed, some of those kinds of elements, those aren't going to generally be under just the student entity year because a lot of those records tend to span multiple years. As such, I'm going to scroll down past the general fields that we're working on. Still going. And then I'm going to come in and there should be my student folder. And there's a reason I'm going to the student folder. If I open up the student folder, there should typically be, for Texas, it has, for Indiana, it's phrased slightly differently, but you'll generally be able to find them because there will be a bulk of them labeled in a similar way. But for this one, I can, for example, scroll down and I've got a set of fields in here that all start out with the verbiage has. So for this one, has active EB. So in this context, has active emergent bilingual. And I can add that field to the screen. And maybe I don't actually want it to say everything like that. And I just need it to say that it's emergent bilingual. So I can have that. These fields are awesome because if I use these, I can do the filtering on the field. And if I do the filtering on the field, those of you that have ever wanted to be able to do quick counts for things like emergent bilingual, special ed, section 504, the more that we get on list views that talk about adding a live tile to a dashboard are normally keyed off of the filters that you make. So if I've made filters for my emergent bilingual, then I can actually go ahead and say, you know, emergent bilingual true, and I could have my live tile in here showing me who exactly is emergent bilingual. Or once again, if I just needed the count, I could see that information as well. So there are things like that that are very interesting to go ahead and do as well. The only thing I don't like about it being under the second folder is I have to click a couple times to get in there, but still, it does let me get in. Let's see. Gifted and talented. And then you just make your fields be what you want. Now, honestly, if there are some special programs that your district doesn't participate in, even if there is a has option or had option or is active, I would say if you're not using it, I wouldn't necessarily worry about adding it as a valid, you know, field column if it's not going to be useful to you. That's one of the reasons I mentioned at the start, potentially deleting to maintain your records. That way you're not having a lot of extra busy stuff in your records when you're trying to look at things. And then you can also concentrate on making sure that you get things in the order you want. Like emergent bilingual came up really early, but emergent bilingual is also related to the field for monitor emergent bilingual. So I could come in and say, oh, I also need monitored emergent bilingual. And if I do it on purpose like that, I can actually have them together, even though in the order they weren't actually originally together. So some of that's just, how you want to go ahead and maintain some of the records. But, you know, just get it as clean as you want. Get those fields out there the way that you're wanting. Now, just as a reminder, there are certain fields that you're not going to be able to grab. So anything that is potentially going to have multiples attached to it, in general, unless the field itself was created with the intention to pull multiple data points onto it, you're generally not going to be able to pull that up. So for example, for special education, if I was looking for the impairments or the special, what do you call it, the services that they were receiving, because most students receive more than one service at a time. While it's nice to be able to know what they are, it's not going to let me pull it onto the screen. Anything that's going to create duplications in the number of lines that I've got associated with the student is going to be prevented from being added to my list screen. So that is definitely a limitation that you have to consider when we're doing list screens. So yes, and in that similar way, I could go ahead and do my favorites. Other things under more, any fields that you've added can be used for a quick report, exporting to Excel. We talked about live tiles, and we also have the create processing list from this screen. So processing lists, just as a reminder, are a way to go ahead and get a group of students visible to go ahead and be utilized in other areas, sometimes for reports and those kinds of things. And so being able to create a processing list can be really nice. I find it useful on screens like this to be able to do a processing list because it means that I can sometimes combine things that are not immediately obvious. So if I needed to look at 11th grade emergent bilingual male students, some of those things are going to be kids that if I went to a specific Student Mass Update, I think has it in there. If I go and use Student Mass Update. So Student Mass Update, I've got my student filters. So if I made a processing list on one of the screens, I could use that as a predefined filter. And yes, I could have done the male, I could have done the grade level, but you'll notice by default, I don't have emergent bilingual as one of the standard filtering options. Now, I could go and do an advanced filter and go find the field for emergent bilingual and go utilize things in those kinds of combinations. But if I'm a user that doesn't typically work with advanced filters, I might find it easier to have made my filter options under my list screen and then go ahead and utilize it from there to pull over here. So processing lists can be really useful for those purposes. We do definitely have resources available walking you through processing lists and how you can go ahead and utilize and maintain them. I just wanted to mention them because it is something that is related to our student list and can be quite useful for that as well. Something else that I find that sometimes people don't look at too often, but can sometimes be interesting. You can actually do list totals on different screens. Um, Let me find one that actually has things that I can count on them. Let me try the focused scheduling view, just so you can see a little bit about what it's going to do. And I'm going to select totals. And there's some things that totals make sense on. So like I might want to see how many conflicts exist. I might want to say, I want to see how many people are currently active. I want to see overscheduled period or people with overscheduled periods. And if I did number of, I do number of requests just so you can see how that sort of looks. So if I save this, what that's going to do is I'm going to have my screen pulled up. And then at the bottom of my screen, it's going to give me a totals option. So I had one kid that had conflicts, and so that's a 1. There were 26 requests total entered. So you notice it's not giving me an average. It's actually literally adding up that whole column. Sometimes that's what you want, but oftentimes I'll have somebody do a total and they're like, ooh, that's not what I meant. So just consider that if you ever use the list totals count, that sometimes it gives you what you're expecting and sometimes it really might not. So number of requests. In this case, I didn't have overscheduled periods at all. So I ended up with a 0, but everybody was currently active based on my setting. So, you know, I can have those counts, which if I'm trying to count multiple different little things like that can be nice. If I have spent the time to do my special programs view, I can get a quick list for that as well. If I change this down to a smaller number, I had it all the way up to 50. Even though I have gone down in the number of records displayed, I am still getting the same totals. I mentioned that specifically because sometimes people worry that if they're not displaying everything, that they will not be able to, or that the counts won't be accurate. The system does count everything, whether it is currently visible on the screen or not. So yeah, just some of those student lists and filter options that can be useful. As I mentioned earlier, there are the functions still under like staff. Staff list has similar things that you can do. So like for teachers in here, are they active for the district? Are they current staff for the entity year? This is one that I'd probably want to have active for everybody because, you know, are they current staff for the entity year is different than some of the other ones. You know, there's things like, am I doing a cleanup? Am I looking for people who have duplicated numbers? For Texas, am I looking for their TSDS unique ID? You know, there's just some of these in here, but all of the same functions that we talked about before will work in context of staff. The Alt Control Alt F3 works here also. So if I'd come in and clicked on that ID link, it does bring me to the browse here where I could go to the view and I could go ahead and make something a district view if I needed to. All right, well guys, we are at 10 o'clock and have come to the end of our session for today. I hope you've gotten something out of this. It's, you know, the idea is just to share some extra information and maybe help you guys out in the long run. So you guys are great, awesome, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.